we do at some point have to assess people. And this is how you initially got involved with functional movement screen, which is one of my absolute favorite tools. I've loved learning about it. I've loved using it with my clients over the years. Can you talk to us a little bit about the history of FMS, what it is, where it came from, and why there was a need for it?
Okay, so first we'll go through the history of how the screen came out. So the two main players are Lee Burton, who's an athletic trainer, and Gray Cook, who's a physical therapist, both in Southern Virginia. And so you have Lee as an athletic trainer who's doing, who's noticing a trend that why are certain kids always in the training room and there's other kids that I never see in the training room, right? And as he's going through his pre-participation physicals, he has a doctor with him who's a wise old doc who's looking at kids. He's asking kids to squat. He's like, why are you asking that? He's like, well, you watch. The kids who can do that well are the kids that you probably don't see as much. And he started seeing this correlation. So that's kind of interesting, and say maybe we can do more movement than this isolated, type of traditional orthopedic testing that we're doing. Now, as that's happening, Gray Cook, who's a physical therapist, he's frustrated by the dogmatic approach of physical therapy and saying that if you have this injury, we'll come in, you get this for that type of thing. Oh, you have a knee injury, well, you're going to come in and you're going to do clamshells and you're going to do TKEs and you're going to do that sort of thing. And saying, well, we don't necessarily work in parts, we work in patterns. And people like Shirley Sarman and pioneers who looked at movement as more of a holistic type of language that we express. He's kind of looking at that. And so he gets called into a major, as he often does, gets called into a major Division I university in their athletics department to look at one of their athletes who had torn his groin off the bone twice, right? Sports hernia, boom. And so they're like, how is this happening? So he goes in this room and this poor kid's up in front of the room in his underwear and everybody in the room is pointing their fingers, right? So the opposite scenario of what we just talked about, right? You have sports medicine docs, you have athletic trainers, you have strength coaches, skill coaches, all point say, you didn't do something right. You did it too much. You did it too little, all blaming each other. And meanwhile, he raises his hand and says, did anybody notice what's going on with his ankles? They said, no, Gray, it's his hip, it's his groin. He said, no, I know that, but like, he has one ankle that doesn't move and the other one does. And so this is one of the fastest kids in the country. So he says, tell me the story. What happened with the ankle? He's like, well, I just rolled it in practice. And they kind of taped it up and just kind of moved forward. And he said, well, where was that in the scheme of the groin injury? He goes, well, it was not right before it. He goes, first I had this thing. And he points to his pubis symphysis, right? Which is right in the front of you, right below your belly button. And he said, well, I had that thing. He goes, what do you mean? He goes, well, what were you doing that caused that? He goes, I don't know. I think it was the high-speed incline treadmill stuff I was doing. So meaning that if you have somebody that has to go up a high-speed incline treadmill and one ankle can fully flex up and the other one can't, you have two options. You're either going to face plant, which a good athlete's not going to do, or you have to hike that hip is the only way you're getting that leg through. So now you hike your hip and you hike your hip and you hike your hip, and that's creating that shearing force up in your pelvis. And now all of a sudden he starts to get irritation there. Now, sure enough, he said, well, what happened next? He said, well, they gave me a cortisone injection. Well, because clearly he had a cortisone deficiency, right? So, with that,
I can't even. It's so ridiculous.
So with that, they took away the signal. Like I always say, like if your smoke alarm's going off in your house tonight in the middle of the night, and you go down, you pop out the 9-volt battery, you didn't put out a fire, right? That was that was the signal. This going back to what I was saying before with the pain, saying something's wrong here. Well, they didn't do that. They did that. He keeps sprinting on it, and boom, he creates this groin tear. Now, before everybody gets nervous, like that if you're losing a little dorsiflexion, that you're going to go tear your groin off the bone. We're talking about incredible amounts of force and amplitude being put through your pelvis. Like I'm not doing that. I just don't move that fast. Like I always joke that I yanked my hamstring in a pickup game of football a year or two ago. I was so excited I actually produced enough force to pull my hamstring. It was like my crowning achievement, my athletic career. But now what happens with this kid is they look very myopically. They do the surgery, they do the rehab where they poke and prod and ice and heat and stim and rub and exercise and stretch, everything related to his groin, but never take a second to look at his ankle. And sure enough, it happens again. So now Gray leaves that situation and says, how did that get missed? Like those are really smart sports medicine, performance and skill people. How does that get missed? Like how, maybe I'm missing that. And so he starts to sketch out, like based on what he's learned so far, what could I do as a quick screen as a filter to make sure I don't miss these things holistically. And that is what kind of became the 7 movements, which became the movement screen as we know it today. And so with that, they started incorporating that into the pre-participation physicals. Started to see some correlations with the kids who are more injured and the kids who are not. Then people start picking up on that, and people like John Tureen, who's a friend of ours who was a strength coach of the Colts for many years, he does the screens on the players and then sits back and looks to see what the data shows. And he notices that the guys who scored poorly were 35% more likely to end up on the injury reserve. Well, if you're looking to protect multi-million-dollar investments, you're going to try to figure out what are your high risk individuals. And so now that starts catching fire a little bit in the NFL. And that's how I got to go do workshops, for 4 different NFL teams, and got to work with the Giants for all those years, is to say we need to protect our investments. And then that trickles over to other sports, and then that trickles into the military. And now it's trickled into the industrial world, where we're seeing people who are using it with factory workers and using it with office workers to say, we want to try to, because what's become the number one cost to insurance companies is musculoskeletal injuries. And so because of that, if we can look at movement as being one of the risk factors in that, if we can take that off the board, we can start to address some of these things. So that's kind of in a nutshell, a real quick history of what's happened in the last 25 years with them. And then with me personally, I had the good fortune of learning from some really smart people and doing internships with Paul Chek and Charles Poliquin. And at the same time, my brother, who's got his DPT, his doctorate in physical therapy, as well as he's just finishing up his PhD in physical therapy. I would kind of steal his books and sneak into his classes and learn from him. And I would learn the stuff about Vladimir Yanda and Florence Kendall and all that stuff. So between that and what I was learning on the fitness side, I really put together this super comprehensive evaluation, right? And I had a couple bottlenecks. The problem was that it took me almost an hour and a half to do. And so because of that, it became prohibitive for a lot of people to afford that if it was going to be worth my time. 2 is that it was right around that time I was opening my facility, and then I was the bottleneck, right? So if people wanted to come in and train, if I wanted them to get evaluated first, because that's what I wanted to believe in terms of customizing the program, well, they had to come see me, and everybody having to filter through me became an issue. And the biggest issue was I was taking all this data, and as much as it was impactful, when I took a step back and critiqued it, it was really cool to know on my goniometer exactly how many degrees of glenohumeral internal rotation you had. But you know what? If you can't breathe right and touch your toes and that the big rocks, simple things, like that stuff didn't matter. And it wasn't really impacting my programming at the end of the day. So I said, how could I maybe filter this down a little bit? So I took my entire staff to one of the first FMS workshops that they had. And I said, listen, what we'll do is now that we know this, let's start doing these screens with everybody coming in, and anything you can't figure out with that screen, then send them to me and I'll do the full eval. Well, my workload cut down 75% right out of the gate. And then over time, I became obsolete, and I loved it, right? Because I didn't need to do these in-depth evaluations with the gross majority of people. That's not what they needed. And so I was having some great success with it. And then I went back and I start reaching out to Lee, and this is early on in FMS. And I said, hey, I want to get involved in this thing. And he says a joke, like he's like, he turned to Gray and said, I got this guy from Jersey calling me. It's like, he wants to get involved. Involved in what? Like, we do this exam for and physicals with high school kids. Like, what are we going to do with it? So he's like, all right, well, why don't you come help us teach whenever we're in the New York area? So I'd come and hang out and help them teach. And then they were like, hey, you know this stuff pretty good. So if we can't be at this course, can you go teach it? And that's how it kind of came to be. And here we are 15, 16 years later, and I'm going around the world teaching it to people, from all walks of life.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. They were great explanation. I love that you kind of found that the FMS was like everything that you needed at least to get started, and really prioritizes the big movements. But you can definitely go down other paths and more assessments and more things that they need to. But starting with that as a foundation, and a test that takes, 10, 15 minutes maybe, and allows you to see overall movement patterns and where the dysfunction lies, I think is so critically important. For somebody who has not done it, can you describe what the process is like and how the scoring works?
So it's super simplistic in that we look at 7 fundamental patterns. Okay, we have 3 what we call top tier integrated patterns, where we look at your overhead deep squat. We look at your what we call your inline lunge, where it's not just it's basically a split squat, but we tie your upper body up specifically in a reciprocal reaching pattern as you do it. We do a single leg step over, which we call our hurdle step. Those are our big 3 patterns on your feet, and then we have 4 more fundamental patterns. 2 are more control biased. 1 that looks more at your reflexive control, called your rotary stability in a quadruped position, hands and knees position. 1 is a trunk stability push-up, where we do a very specific setup to check how well you sync up and create gross stability in your trunk. And then we have a few that are more mobility biased, where we look at a laying on your back leg raise, but not just how high you can lift your leg, but how high you can lift your leg without having any effect on the opposite side. And then we also look at your shoulder mobility, basically a reciprocal behind your back reaching pattern. And then we've recently added ankle mobility in there. And then based on that, I can start to get a pretty good profile of where you're at in terms of, are you somebody that needs more mobility, somebody that needs more control, or are you somebody that needs a little bit of both? And it's also not part specific, because if you tell me, oh, well, I have a tight hip flexor. Well, that tight hip flexor squatted just fine. And it also lunge just fine. But now all of a sudden, as soon as I ask you to pick up 1 leg, now all of a sudden that hip flexor is not working anymore. So it's not a hip flexor problem. It's a hurdle step problem. It's a single leg balance problem. So let's piece that out. Let's dig down that rabbit hole. Now, that's it. And then based on that, what it tells me is in terms of scoring, it tells me if something is just fine. You have, in terms of what we're looking for, you have enough movement and competency that we're not worried about it. It could be that it's not at least meeting the minimums, and that's where we should do 2 things. Number 1 is, most importantly, we need to remove the negative, kind of the old Hippocratic oath of do no harm, that there's certain exercises you probably shouldn't do, at least right now. And then there are some things that we can do. We can create some strategies that can help improve that movement and improve it enough that you can start going back and doing those things we took away. And then we also look to tease out, is there pain? And that's regardless of how well you move. It's just to see, does that hurt? Because if that hurts, like I said before, that needs clinical attention. Now, that being said, there's a lot of misconceptions. And when I teach FMS, it's more about teaching what it's not than it is than actually what it is, right? What it's not. It is not a clinical diagnostic. I can't tell you have a torn labrum or any sports hernia based on this. It's not made for people in pain, so it's not making me trying to be a physical therapist. It just tells me when I need one. It is not sports specific. So when people say, oh, well, I don't like using FMS because it's not specific to golf. Well, it was never designed to be. It's designed to be baseline fundamental human movement. If you need something specific for golf, once you can check the boxes in your FMS, well, then go do a TPI screen, because that is specific to the dynamics of golf, right? So that's where that is. Well, the FMS doesn't predict performance. You're right. We never said it would. It was never meant to predict performance. It doesn't have a correlation with that. And so it doesn't necessarily so much tell me what to do in your program. It more just tells me what not to do. And if there's any way I could really, sum it up, I've talked with other instructors that we have about, like, what would be our goal if you took our level 1 course, as you walking away, whether you're a physical therapist, athletic trainer, personal trainer, strength coach, what would be my main goal of having you do a movement screen? It's to get us to not do dumb shit. It's pretty that simple, right? So, when you look at injuries, everybody says, well, it's an injury prevention tool. Kinda. We look at this as being one risk factor in injuries, but there's a lot of risk factors in injuries: sleep, previous injury, your body fat levels. All these things are risk factors. And when you put them all in a blender, then we can kind of see a risk profile. But this is just one factor we've never really had a objective, simple, and easy to use tool for. And that's where it fits. That's where it creates its niche, right? Like when I work with the Giants, we had athletic trainers and medical professionals if you're hurt. We had strength coaches to get you better. But there's a lot of people in that gray area. I'm not really hurt enough to go in there, but I'm not really healthy enough to do everything he's asking me to do. And how do I address this gray area? And so that's kind of what it's looking at in terms of, we look at injuries and people have the expression case where they'll say, like, oh, you can go out, you walk out the door, get hit by a bus today, right? Of course you can, but I'm not going to be the one pushing you in front of the bus.